Welcome to episode 2 of Project PhDcast. I am Alison Innes. I am your host. I am the creator, and I am the brand new PhD student navigating my way through doing PhD level work on podcasting. And I'm really excited to have you join me. I was spoiled for choice when I was thinking about what I wanted to talk about for this month's episode. I've been reading some really fantastic scholarly articles about podcasting and podcasting ethics, which is an area I'm really, really interested in. I'm reading a fantastic book by Siobhan McHugh about the power of podcasting and audio storytelling. And of course, podcasting was in the news, as if I didn't have enough to keep myself entertained. Just the other day, the Canadian government announced their move to require large podcasting businesses to register with the CRTC, the Canadian Radio Television Communications Council, I think. I'm not 100% sure. At any rate, that is something I will be following, and I've got a lot of questions, as do a lot of people right now, about what this means for podcasting in Canada. And there's lots of interesting questions with that. But I thought instead of addressing some of those things, which I certainly hope to come back to at some point, I thought I would tell you a little bit about my research project. So I am currently working on a project that is not the project I applied to do my PhD on, but is actually related in some underlying ways in terms of some of the themes and ideas that I am exploring in it. So podcasting hit the headlines on the CBC, the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, back in February 2023, when the City of Toronto budget came up for discussion. And a reporter at the time, and I'll put a link in the show notes, revealed that the Toronto Police Services was spending $337,000 on a podcast via a sole source contract. And my first thought was, wow, I am in the wrong business because I want to be making $337,000 doing my podcasting. The news kind of focused on the sole source contract aspect of it, which was interesting. But there were a lot of podcasting related, a lot of ethical and transparency questions that arose for me. So according to the CBC, the Toronto Police Services, TPS, claimed that their podcast called 24 Shades of Blue had 94,500 downloads at that time, including YouTube views. So it's an audio and a video podcast at an average cost of $3 per download. The initial season was created by a company called Iben Inc. as a sole source contract, which was renewed. As I said, some people were very critical of the budget and the contract. Some people have questioned why the police are doing a podcast at all. So my questions, though, kind of went into how does this work? What does a podcast from a government-funded agency look like? And what kind of ethical expectations should we as listeners have when we are listening to these things that are being produced with our taxpayer money? As of September 2023, the 24 Shades of Blue has 47 episodes listed on the Toronto Police Services YouTube channel. Episodes vary in length from 6 to 40 minutes, and they feature interviews hosted by Andy O'Brien and Axel Villamil, who are the co-founders of the Obian Axe Inc. production company. Interviewees include staff from across the Toronto Police Services, from the chief, detectives, 911 dispatchers, community services officers, I think there's some traffic officers, forensic investigators, and communications staff. There are also series on missing persons and cold cases. And the show is available everywhere you would expect a podcast to be available. Anyway, so interesting to me as somebody who creates podcasts and listens to a lot of podcasts, including professionally produced podcasts and independent podcasting. This show provides no production credits, no contact information, and no transcripts. I did write to the police requesting a transcript, and I was basically told, there's services online that can generate a transcript for you. I was able to pull transcripts from the YouTube files, but there is no connection, there's no links, there's no language on the audio podcast that accessibility is there. So I certainly had questions around the AODA, the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act requirements around that. And that is something that I want to investigate further. So I had a number of research questions that have arisen from the several CBC articles about this and my own Freedom of Information Access request, FOIA request that I put in in March, and I got the information in June. Of course, I didn't get everything I wanted, and I will probably be asking for some more information in the near future as I refine some of my research questions and some of the research that I'm doing. My overarching research question here is to examine how a decentralized and democratized medium like podcasting is being used by centralized organizations like government agencies to influence society's perception of them and to influence societal conversations about issues that are important to our democracy. So how do the Toronto Police Services present themselves and policing in their interviews? How do they convey ideas of authority? How do the police services frame the relationship between their members and the community at large through the choices of the topics they cover, their language, their interviewees? How do the production company and Toronto Police Services negotiate the creation process? What ethical and professional guidelines should citizens expect from government agency podcasts? And that's kind of that last one is kind of like the big question I'm working towards. So in doing this research, every question I have has just revealed more and more questions. And it's kind of exciting. It's also given me a lot of different avenues that I can go with in terms of examining where this project is going. And I've been fortunate that my research on Copagandacasting is going to contribute to a larger research project that my PhD supervisor, Dr. Erin Morrow at Brock University, is involved in around AI and online toxicity and those kinds of things. So some really important questions that this one podcast raises and really important issues that it engages with. So some of the themes that I am talking about or that I am researching and we'll get into in future podcast episodes are things like communication ethics. What kinds of ethics do we need to be thinking about, particularly in terms of podcasting and in terms of government communication with citizens as well? And how should government agencies be nurturing their relationship with their citizens? And why that is really important when it comes to trust in government and information, misinformation, and disinformation. And misinformation and disinformation are really big topics right now, too. So part of my research then is figuring out okay, what makes an ethical podcast? Journalists have ethics that they're expected to abide by. Broadcast radio and TV stations have ethics they're expected to abide by. So what does ethics look like for podcasting when podcasts are created by people who aren't journalists and people and organizations who can put whatever they want out on a podcast? And so then what kind of ethics should we be expecting from our government podcasts? A few of the red flags that this particular podcast with the Toronto Police Services raised for me, and again, these are things that I am still digging into, and so I'll be coming back and talking more about them, are around transparency, about who is paying for it. As I said, there's no transparency in the show itself about who's paying for it or about the show's connection with the Toronto Police Services, that this is a product that they are paying for and that they have editorial influence over. There seems to be certainly some obfuscation there about the connection between TPS and the podcasting company. And I certainly have some quotes and whatnot from the memo that indicate that the Toronto Police Services is trying to avoid accusations of propaganda. Again, propaganda, just defining opened up a whole new rabbit hole as well. So, like I said, everything I look at in this research project is bringing more questions to examine. There are also some red flags around dignity and respect. Certainly, with having episodes about missing people or cold cases, that kind of thing, especially when there's children involved, there is nothing in the information that I have from the police services around what process they went through in terms of dealing with the families and to do those podcast episodes in a way that doesn't harm people. And that is something that ties into the bigger conversation around true crime podcasting, I think, because true crime podcasting is very popular. Sometimes we see it being done about crimes that are historical and that have resolved in the courts. Sometimes, like with the case of Serial, you see it unfolding in somewhat real time, and then you see it actually having impact and interacting with future legal developments as well of a particular case. So there's a lot of questions there around dignity and ideas of dignity and respect when it comes to anything that's true crime. And again, particularly when these are coming from government-funded agencies. Another red flag that I'm investigating here is the purpose of the messaging. What exactly the Toronto Police Services is saying, at least in the documentation I've been able to obtain about the purpose of the podcast. They claim it's successful, but they have not been willing to share any statistics with me. So that's something that I am still hoping that I will be able to obtain some statistics. Interestingly, again, from the Toronto Police Services internal document, the podcast is proving very popular with people already in the force and people adjacent to those people. While creating a podcast for a group of people within an organization, there's nothing wrong with doing that. But again, stepping back, looking at some of the rhetoric, both coming from police and coming from people who question what police do and how police in general conduct themselves. There's some questions there. Is this really the best use of resources, or is this reinforcing an internal message about the organization to the people within the organization? So anyway, there are a number of interesting questions there that I am also investigating. So this might seem like just a little podcast. Why would anybody care? And as I've mentioned already, this is really part of larger conversation about what it means to be a citizen in our democracy today and how we interact with government agencies and how those agencies can foster openness and inclusion and a sense of responsibility. I was also reading a really interesting article recently about hosts and the parasocial relationship with hosts and the way that plays into the spread of misinformation and disinformation because of podcasting intimacy, and that people are inclined to trust podcasters through that parasocial relationship. They feel like they have a relationship with that person and that person is trustworthy. So the power of podcasting to persuade, both for good or for bad, is an important part of this conversation as well. To kind of sum it up, the bigger question I'm looking at with this Copaganda podcasting project is how should governments and government agencies use podcasting to foster trust and transparency? What should citizens expect from government podcast communications, and what obligations do governments have in this medium? So a lot of really interesting questions, and I am hoping that you will join me on the journey of this podcast as I work away at unpacking some of these aspects. I was fortunate to be able to share this preliminary research at the recent Emerging Research in Podcast Studies Symposium, which was an international online symposium. And I'll be talking about some of this again in November at a Brock University symposium. It's got a lot of legs. So that's it in a nutshell. That is what I am working on right now. And join me for the journey. And I will see you next month for episode 3. Thanks.